realm. And the title tonight, Unique Whales of Oman. I don't normally use the word unique very often in terms of marine life and so on, but here I think we can genuinely use that term. And I'm going to be talking about the history and mystery, current study going on, and an uncertain future for whales in Oman, and particularly this animal here, which is a humpback whale. And I'll take you through a story that's unfolded over the last 4 decades, basically a really remarkable story. I'm going to begin way back 1982 on a slightly unusual note. It's a humpback whale. It's a male. We know that because he's singing and the females don't. What we don't really know is why they sing anywhere in the world. They sing all around the world in the tropics where they breed. But why they do it is still a little bit of a mystery, whether to attract females or to signal territory to other males is a bit unknown. But in 1982, a couple of researchers were on their way to Sri Lanka. A couple of whale researchers, Hal Whitehead and Abigail Alling. They stopped off at the Halaniat Islands off southern Oman in Dhofar. And they dropped a hydrophone, an underwater microphone, into the water. And this is the sound that they heard. Clearly a humpback whale, and they knew it was a humpback whale. And so they broadcast that message to the international scientific community that studies whales and wondered what to do with it. Everyone was scratching their heads, and it didn't quite fit the usual thinking around where humpback whales should be found. And so everyone sort of ignored it if you can. But as we'll find out later on in the talk, it's a very, very unusual song, and it was the beginning of a long story, which we've gradually uncovered and gradually revealed what is going on with these humpback whales in the most unlikely place in the world, off the coast of Oman. In 1985, Michael Gallagher, who some of you would have known, took this photograph, a slightly out of focus, black and white photograph of clearly a humpback whale tail fluke. So that chance recording was then followed by photographic evidence of the occurrence of humpback whales off Oman. And then for the next 5 or 6 years, gradually data were collected, particularly throughout Oman and on all kinds of cetaceans, whales and dolphins, as well as many other things, mostly by Rod Sam, sitting in the audience right here, who was leading at the time an IUCN project to construct a coastal zone management plan for Oman. And my career began with Rod, who was my mentor in the early days. So thank you very much for that, Rod. And he began to build up a database of records of whales and dolphins throughout Oman. And what was particularly interesting is that it began to reveal mothers with calves, as well as, oops, sorry, wrong button, as well as feeding whales, all in the same location. And it also revealed sightings in almost every month of the year. So for those of you who don't know about humpback whales generally, that's incredibly unusual. In fact, there is nowhere else on Earth where you would expect to see that. They migrate and they move between breeding and feeding grounds, which can be spatially several thousand kilometers away and temporally 6 months apart. So what was going on? And it caused people to start thinking a lot more about those early records in 1982 and 1985, but now backed up by a lot more records coming to the fore. And so we began to ask ourselves, well, what might be happening in this, what is essentially a cul-de-sac of an ocean? compared to all the other oceans around the world, where you have breeding ground tropical waters accessible to polar feeding grounds. But in Oman, we didn't have that. And it was a very, very long way for them to swim all the way down on migration to Southern Ocean feeding grounds. Now, whales feeding in polar waters because that's where the majority of the planet's marine food resources are, because of very strong upwellings in those regions. So we began to ask ourselves, well, if they're clearly here in Oman, where do they come from? To where do they migrate, and from where do they migrate? And when might they be doing that if we're seeing them in every month of the year? And nobody thought at that time, well, maybe they don't migrate at all, because that was not heard of and seemingly impossible. So moving on, in 1994, Rod and I wrote this book called The Whales and Dolphins of Oman, and Rod's opening line there was, Oman is one of the world's best kept cetacean secrets. We didn't really intend that to have so much meaning, but it turned out to have a lot more meaning, as we'll find out as we go on. But gradually we were building a much bigger picture of the humpback whales as well as other large whales and many other dolphins. 22 species now recorded in total in Oman. And then in 1997, a huge revelation occurred, huge revelation to us, because the International Whaling Commission Scientific Committee Oman hosted a meeting of that committee. It's an annual meeting, which happens all around the world. And Oman hosted it back in 1997. And one of the things that was revealed in that meeting by the Soviet party there was that the Soviets had been illegally whaling in Oman in the 60s, particularly 2 seasons in 1965 and 1966. And they brought with them 3 factory vessels like this and 30 catcher ships. And they came out of the Mediterranean through the Red Sea. And normally they would turn right and go southwards down to whaling grounds in the Southern Ocean. But they were bumping into whales in the Gulf of Aden. So they decided that in 1965 to turn left and go up north, and they ended up going up the coast of Yemen and into Oman. And they took thousands of whales over the next couple of years. But one advantage of that carnage was that it gave a lot of data, because they would have scientists on board those vessels who were collecting data on those whales, collecting information. And it gave us some very clear answers, because in amongst their catch were pregnant females and females with full stomachs, and both. So there we had very conclusive evidence that these whales were feeding and breeding in exactly the same location at the same time, which normally is spaced by at least 6 months apart. So it raised a lot more questions now all of a sudden. Well, okay, so now we know they are more than likely resident, but where do they come from? We still didn't know that. What about that behavioral ecology, this really unusual situation of breeding and feeding in the same place? No other whales around the world do that. So that is an incredible revelation. And of course, we started thinking, well, how many are there? What's their population status? And what's their conservation status? And the IWC Scientific Committee drew this map back then, which was the only part of the world where we have a dotted line, which is basically possible migration, thinking that they're most likely migrating to the southern hemisphere still. But we didn't believe that anymore. So we set out in what was called the Oman Whale and Dolphin Research Group back in 2000, with the money in our pockets and a small vessel with a 25 horsepower motor on the back to try and go out and study these whales. And we had a little nice kind of scene with NGO, government and commercial organizations working together to go out and try and study these whales, and particularly the humpback whales, which are a little bit easier to find, a little bit more inquisitive than other whales, a little bit slower in their movements. So we're more likely to find them than some of the other large whales, which we'll come to in a minute. And we began doing systematic vessel transect surveys. We graduated from a very small Yamaha skiff with a 25 horsepower engine to a slightly bigger rib, 6-meter rib, with a couple of engines on the back. So we were able to, which was donated by PDO back then. and we were able to get out, and we particularly targeted areas where we knew the Soviet whalers had been catching, because they were very, very efficient at finding whales. So where they found them, we thought we'd most likely find them. So we targeted the Dhofar region around the Halaniats down here, Salalah, and the Gulf of Manzira Island and Duqm around that area. And we conducted systematic vessel transit surveys for the next few years. We took a lot of photographs to conduct photo identification studies. We had hydrophones, like the one that Hal and Abigail had back in the day in 1982 to record any whale song. We had a crossbow to take skin samples for biopsy to look at the genetics. We followed whales, we watched them, we tried to understand how they were using their habitats, what their behavior was. And when we couldn't get out for lack of money for any fuel, even though it was cheap in those days, we did a lot of beach combing and to look for any remains of whales or anything else on beaches. And in 2005, we really started to ramp up the research. And the Environment Society of Oman had been formed, and it took on the old Oman Whale and Dolphin Research Group, plus some. And we started to focus particularly keenly on the photo ID to begin with. So back in those days, we didn't wear life jackets or anything. We don't do that anymore. So that's an old photograph. But we were trying to maximize our encounters with humpback whales so we could get photographs, as many as we could, because photographs are incredibly useful. And we photographed particularly the left and right side of dorsal fins and tail flukes. And each of those is unique to each individual. So we were gradually able to build up a catalogue of individual whales that we came to know by name over the years. And there's lots of reasons for wanting to do that. But one of the really useful things about understanding your whales intimately like that is that you can estimate the population size. If you get enough photographs over a long enough period of time, through simple mark recapture, you can estimate the number. So if you have a population of tens of thousands of whales, the chances of photographing one season and one the next season are pretty slim. If you've got a population of only 10 whales, chances of reciting one individual much, much higher. So you can work out pretty accurately what your total population number is through that mark recapture process. So that's what we did, and we came up with an estimate. A lady called Gianna Minton, who was doing her PhD on humpback whales, the first of the PhDs on humpback whales in Oman. There's been one or two others, and other PhDs on cetaceans by various members of the team over the years. And she looked at a population estimate. By that time, by the way, we'd started to try and match these whale tails and dorsal fins with other whales in other parts of the world. So Southern Ocean, anywhere we could think of, anywhere in the Indian Ocean, across to the Pacific, to see if anybody else was seeing our whales somewhere else, which would tell us if they're moving across distances. And we didn't find any matches at all. So the IWC, the International Whaling Commission, then named our population X. They had no idea where it was coming from, but they knew it was a stock of whales, and they knew they had to name it something. So they called it Population X. And the estimate revealed there were about 82 whales. So it's a tiny little population. And that was off Oman. There may be a few more, may have been, we weren't sure in those days, a few more whales elsewhere in the northwestern Indian Ocean. But certainly it was a very tiny, it makes it one of the rarest whales in the world. And in 2011, the scientific committee of the IWC finally recognized the population as distinct and called it the Arabian Sea humpback whale. And one of the ways in which we were able to make that distinction and recognize that isolation was through biopsying. So collecting whale skin samples using a crossbow, which we then were able to process. There's a crossbow bolt which strikes the whale, bounces off it, takes a tiny plug of skin. Quite often the whale doesn't even feel it. If it does, it will react, but not for long. Soon enough, they're coming back around the vessel again. But it takes a little piece of really valuable skin, which we would process in the field. This is Peter Corcoran from NOAA, who came out to help us back in the early days. And we would process that sample and then we'd analyze it. And what we found was that our humpback whales were sitting in a dendrogram like this, separate from everything else, but clearly related to Southern Ocean whales sometime back in the past. And in fact, that time was 70,000 years ago. So this population of whales have been isolated from all other populations from its origin in the Southern Hemisphere for 70,000 years, a kind of relic population. Imagine what's happened in 70,000 years. Ice ages, rise and fall of sea level, all kinds of things. And this population has been sitting off there for that long. A couple of years ago, myself and colleague Koen van Burbeck, we went to Paris, to the basement of the Natural History Museum there, to sample the holotype of the Arabian region's humpback whale, which was actually found in Kuwait back in 1860. We took a sample of that because now geneticists are feeling like we might have a new species of whale here, a whole new species of humpback whale in Oman. So that is work in progress to see whether we do have a distinct species, separate species, or just a population. So we'll see what becomes of that analysis once it's complete. We were in the meantime finding no matches still for any of our tail flukes, each one very unique and really different from other whales elsewhere in the world. And we were beginning to understand what was going on in terms of the oceanography and the ecology of the animals. So the mechanism by which they were able to stay in this part of the world rather than migrating was largely down to the monsoon season, the kharif. And the kharif, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it, but it's a process, a weather-driven process, which involves a sustained, consistent upwelling of nutrient-rich cold water from the ocean depths. When things die in the ocean and things get washed into the ocean and everything else, it all sinks and it gets locked up at the bottom of the ocean. All that nutrient gets locked up at the bottom of the ocean. But just in a few parts of the world, very few, the poles, the west coast of Africa, the west coast of South America, you get these very sustained upwellings. And in the west coasts of those continents, it's largely because of the spin of the Earth is why you get those upwellings. Here in Oman, it's a little bit different. And the reason is the Himalayan mountain range, essentially. At this time of year, it's 40 degrees in Oman. I was talking to a colleague yesterday in Oman. It's just reached 40 degrees over there. So it's very, very hot in this part of the world. And the snow is beginning to melt up here in the Himalayas. And as that happens, air is dragged across the northern Indian Ocean from south of the equator, all the way up the Himalayan mountain range. And that sustained wind all the way across that northern Indian Ocean pulls surface waters away from Oman and Somalia and Yemen in particular. And when that surface water is dragged away, physics says it has to be replaced by something, and it's replaced by water welling up from the ocean depths. So you get this tremendous fueling of the ecosystem from the very bottom of the food chain, the seaweeds and so on, all the way up to the great whales. And that's what's been sustaining these whales in this region for so long. We also began a really intensive program of acoustics, so listening to whales underwater, using these passive acoustic monitors. Sal Sergio here from the New England Aquarium in those days, who helped us to deploy these incredible systems, which we would leave sometimes, and we're still doing it actually, and we would leave sometimes on the ocean seabed for 6-9 months, and they would be recording whale song all that time. And analysis of that song by Sal and colleagues provide us with another line of evidence of isolation. And the song was completely different, and in fact, very, very primitive compared to other humpback whale songs around the world, a bit like banging bongo drums compared to modern music. It's incredibly primitive, kind of relic and left behind. And what was particularly unique about it is that it didn't change much over time. It had this temporal stasis over multiple years. So normally, humpback whales that are migrating will meet in feeding grounds, even if they've got separate breeding grounds. And there's cultural exchange that goes on in those feeding grounds where bits of song are shared between animals and they take them back to their breeding grounds. And so the song evolves. And every single year, there's a completely different song sung because of that shift. But in Oman, that wasn't happening. So we had the same song being sung every year, almost. A little bit of change, but any change was just from a kind of rearrangement of existing song phrases within that region. So again, another unique feature about these whales. Then the last 10 years, 2014 until now, we really intensified the research, and we recognized, for example, that Oman, although it's been leading the way in this work for so many years until 2014, was not the only country where we might want to look. So we got busy with building a regional team. So this is Andy Wilson in the front here, and Asma Al-Balushi from the Environment Society of Oman. Andy was another of the PhD students and who's lived and worked in Oman for many years now. And he's really been driving this work, particularly latterly. His name will come up again in a minute. There's Asma listening in. Howard Gray, another PhD student, this time looking at bottlenose dolphins in Oman, but always along on the field trips in the early days. Tim Collins, who was a real driving force behind the very beginning of whale research in Oman back in 2000 or 1999, 2000. Igor, excuse Igor, he's sort of mixed cultural heritage, but he was a tagger. Mohammed from Halania, Thailand's our boat captain, still is a fantastic person. Badr al-Balushi from the Environment Authority of Oman. And then we had regional guests coming. So Dipani Sutaria here, for example, from India. And we gave her a hydrophone, we gave her gifts, and she went back to India and started doing what we were doing in Oman back in India. We also invited our Iranian friends to come over, Hamid Moshiri and Nazanin, and Shoaib Kiani from Pakistan. So we started to try and expand this work out to other countries in the region to investigate what was going on in those countries. And we began a process of satellite tagging. And there's Igor with his satellite tagging instrument, and at the tip there is the tag, and that goes into the whale. It's quite intrusive, and I wouldn't say it doesn't hurt them. I think it isn't nice for them, not comfortable at the time. But we spent 2 years discussing with the IWC Scientific Committee whether or not to do this kind of tagging on this population. It's done on many whales all around the world. And after a lot of debate, it was decided that the benefits to be gained from understanding the whales better outweighed the small amount of risk that comes from tagging a whale like that. And a lot of protocols that we had to follow, including bringing in a whole team internationally who'd done it all before in other parts of the world, vets and so on. And we had to follow whales for hours and hours and hours after the tagging process. And then for years afterwards, watching the site of that tag where it had been implanted. It falls out after a few weeks or a few months. And all that was left after a year is a small mark like that. And then after another year or two, it shrinks to a tiny scar. And we haven't seen any other evidence of injury or ill health in any of the whales here or elsewhere in the world. So it turned out to be probably the right decision. At the same time, we also were deploying hydrophones across the ocean basin, so in India and Pakistan and so on, so we could look at cross-ocean sounds going on, getting some finer and more broad-scale information so that we could help to inform conservation management. I'll come back to that question in a minute. We've deployed about 15 tags so far, all on known whales, so all whales that we've known for many years. And the process of tagging is chase down a whale. I mean, that's what we had to do. We would chase down the whale, get close enough to it, fire from a modified pneumatic ship-to-shore anchor gun, a tag into the top of the whale. At the same time, shoot a biopsy to get a genetic sample, a skin sample from the whale for genetic analysis. The delivery tube flies off, the whale disappears, and the tag, not quite far enough in this case, it only lasted a few days, this one, usually sinks in a little bit further, remains on the whale. And that transmits every time the whale comes to the surface. So we can follow those whales for however long that tag stays in the whale. Usually the tag falls out well before the battery runs out, because the whales kind of work it out. a bit like a thorn or something. They gradually work it out of their bodies, and it drops off and sinks. Costs about $5,000 a tag, so it's always it's a pity if you miss, which occasionally we did, and it's a pity that they all sink. But if they floated, we wouldn't know if it was still on the whale or not. So we need it to sink as soon as it falls off. So that's the end of the tag. And Andy Wilson, who I mentioned earlier, then looked at that information as part of his PhD. And this is what we found. So we found the whales were mostly barely moving and mostly staying very close to the coast. This is the Gulf of Masira Island, Dukum, Salalah, down off the coast of Dhofar. So moving between these two areas particularly, and 80-odd% of them staying very coastal, occasionally going offshore. And that was quite interesting because humpback whales are always thought to be animals that are exclusively coastal. But these whales were making forays into very deep water and diving to 200 meters or more, presumably in search of food. And then we had one or two anomalies, one which crossed the border out of Oman into Yemen. That was the first transboundary whale that we encountered. And then one female swam to India. Her name was Luban. And she swam, well, we lost sight of her up there somewhere. The tag stopped transmitting. The next time it transmitted, she was in India, just off Vasco da Gama. Swam down to Cochin, spent some time right down here in the southern tip of India off Kerala, and then went all the way back. We lost transmission again, but she turned up back in the Gulf of Masira. So she did a complete journey for us. And all the other tagged animals were males, and they all stayed local. But evidently the females don't do that. They go a little bit further afield. So Andy then, as part of his PhD, started on what's called an ensemble ecological niche model. And what that does is it basically takes known points that whales occur, wherever that is, and you get a lot of known points from satellite tagging. And there's a whole time series of data as well as a spatial set of data. So tens of thousands of data points, which then, if you then look at where those whales occur, what are the conditions simplistically, what are the conditions in which those whales occur? So what is the water depth? What is the slope of the seabed? What is the distance from shore? What is the temperature of the water? What is the chlorophyll A content of the water? And you look at all of that where they do occur, and then you can model how likely it is that they will occur elsewhere in the region. And you produce a heat map of darkest red being the most likely place for them to be, and going lighter and lighter yellow as the less likely place, but still suitable conditions for them to occur. So we can see that it didn't cover an awful lot of ground, and it was very focused in this particular area with very clear hotspots, which the whalers a long time ago had found and which we'd subsequently been studying. We also, during this period of 2014 to 2024, ramped up the photo ID in a big way. We now have a quite extensive photo ID catalogue of pretty much all the whales we think that are regularly visiting there or regularly in Oman in the area. But we're still discovering more occasionally, but we're getting also an awful lot of resites, and we're beginning to understand a lot more about their localized movements, who they're pairing with, social dynamics of the whales, and so on. This is Luban, the same whale that we satellite tagged. We satellite tagged him in 21st of November 2017 on the right-hand side of the body. We've taken biopsy samples from her, so we know she's a female, and she doesn't seem to move very far out of the Gulf of Masira in Oman, where we see her, except, of course, we know she swam to India. And we've been tracking her now for 20 years, and some whales even a little bit longer than that. So it gives you a feeling. And some of the whales, there's a whale called Saddle, for example, that we rescued from a fishing net off Dukum in the year 2000. Not the first whale to be rescued from a fishing net. There were others before that. But we rescued her from a fishing net in 2000. We're still seeing her at least up until 2022. We haven't seen her since, but so some idea of longevity there. And of course, we're able now to look again at the population status of these whales, because we're getting more and more photographs, so we can refine those models, those calculations around how many whales we actually have. And I can't tell you too much about that because it's kind of work in progress, and it's been the subject of a lot of discussion lately at the International Whaling Commission, which has just been completed for this year, the scientific committee meeting. But there's no real sign of recovery. So we've still got very, very low numbers. You might expect populations to be growing or doing something, but we're still at very, very low numbers. More on that in a minute. We also got drones into the action. So we teamed up with other universities around the world, and we got drones involved because we had been noticing that our whales had these kind of grey patches on them. Kind of roundish, mostly lesions on the skin. So we deployed drones to fly above the whales to get a better view of what was going on, and we were finding this funny what was called a tattoo skin disease, which is known in other species of dolphins particularly, but I'm still not sure exactly what it is. Some sort of pox virus, a bit like smallpox or something, but we don't really know very much about it. But it was originally in the early days covering 2 or 3% of the body and affecting a certain number of whales in our population. At the same time, we looked at things like any scarring on the whales, and we looked at body condition. So by taking enough photographs directly overhead or in a oblique angle, with enough data points around that whale, you can actually work out the fat content, the body condition of those whales, particularly if you compare them with whales that you know that fat content with from elsewhere in the world. So that told us that our whales are actually pretty healthy. They're quite well fed and doing quite well, except that they had this chronic disease. And we found the disease was increasing, spreading through the population, and also becoming more severe in individuals. So, and at least gone up at least 20% in the last 10 years. And it could be that a disease like that is exacerbated by stress. So the building noise, particularly vessel noise, as vessel traffic has increased in Oman over the years, might be causing stress, making this disease more severe and more prevalent, as well as quite regular entanglement in fishing gear. And we'll come back to that, because one of the other things we looked at was scarring on these whales. So moving forward, we suddenly got whales covered in this tattoo-like skin disease, all these lesions. And you can see here as well scars down the body. And it could be that this very low genetic diversity in these whales, these isolated, unique whales, may make them more susceptible to disease. We have no idea how it affects them either. So we don't know whether this is encumbering them. As I say, the body condition is good. But we've probably seen 10 calves in 30 years. So reproduction is clearly very low. And maybe this is something to do with it. Who knows? Just turning to some other large whales, because the humpbacks are not the only large whales in Oman. And this talk is entitled Unique Whales of Oman, not just humpback whales of Oman. So the blue whale is another whale which we began encountering a little bit more frequently than before. It's very recognizable. It's kind of got a bluey sheen to it. But this tiny dorsal fin right at the very back of the whale gives it away, but also the enormous size of the animals. And we've been sampling those as well. And we've also been recording song of those as well. And all indication is that they are isolated in this northwestern Indian Ocean region as well. There's some movement, because we know that the song type is heard in the Chagos, for example, and in Madagascar, where song has been recorded of very similar to that of Oman. But there's no gene flow between these areas that we know of at the moment. We need more samples, but it feels like these whales may also be isolated. And ditto the Bruder's whale, another very large whale, not quite as large as the blue whale. The blue whale will get up to, in our case, 20, 21 meters, something like that. So what's that? Twice the length of this haul. The Bruder's whale is growing to 15 or 16 meters, not dissimilar to the humpback. And again, we've been sampling these whales, biopsying them, collecting skin samples for genetic analysis. And there's some movement we know between the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea, but no further than that as far as we can tell. So we've got another large whale which also might be isolated in the Arabian Sea region. So what is it perhaps that might be preventing the recovery of these whales, especially turning back to the humpbacks, which we know most about? And we've got an increasing level of threat from shipping, as I mentioned, not just noise, but also vessel strikes. And again, Andy Wilson, as part of his PhD, did some fantastic work looking at the tracks of shipping in the region, comparing that with the ensemble, the ecological niche model, and then coming up with a ship strike index to understand, well, how likely is it that animals are being struck by vessels? And what's disturbing is the incredible overlap between the vessel traffic and where the whales are likely to be occurring or are known to occur. And we've got a very high possibility of strike in some really key areas for the whales. We've also had ports and harbors being developed at a great pace in Oman. Since the beginning of the work there, we've had Sohar, we've had Duqm, we've had Salalah, had Muscat port expanding as well. So there's been a great investment in port and harbor infrastructure, and Duqm particularly is right in that absolute hotspot for humpback whales in Oman, and they still come in there. This was taken just a few years ago. The humpback mother and calf actually that came into the port basin, causing great consternation to the port authorities. So we mobilized a team, this time with proper PPE on in modern era, to rescue that whale, to take the net off it. We used to get in the water, Rod will remember, we used to get in the water with the whales. That's absolutely no. You should not do that. And nowadays it's all done from the surface, from the boat, technique that's been carefully worked out. But net entanglements, are pretty common, and in fact, 60% of our whales carry the scars of net entanglements, and sometimes more than just a scar. They'll lose half a tail fluke or even a whole tail fluke, and it can be quite severe. And then recently in Oman as well, the first offshore oil and gas exploration and production has now started. And that brings with it threat of pollution, but also a lot more noise in key habitats. Again, this is in the Gulf of Mazira. And whale watching is building as an industry. It's slow at the moment, but it's gradually being introduced. So we produced with the Environment Society of Oman these guidelines, for example, to try and help guide people how to watch whales responsibly. But again, with such a small population of sensitive whales, one has to be very careful when introducing tourism that's directed towards watching these rare and wonderful whales. And as I mentioned, additional threats from a more natural cause, like this tattoo skin disease and parasites and so on. But what's interesting to ask is that genetic limitation, that very low genetic diversity, are all these threats stopping the population from recovering and growing, or is there a genetic component to that which is somehow affecting reproduction? Are there just too few whales to meet and find each other? Was whaling just too devastating that the population's never quite managed to get back up on its feet again? But there's definitely hope for the future for these whales, in spite of all of what I've just said. And I don't want to end on a doom and gloom message, but global populations of humpback whales are increasing incredibly well, like 10 or 11% increase per year in many parts of the world, absolutely booming since whaling was banned. And that 10 or 11% is kind of like biological maximum for this species. So how they're actually reaching that maximum, in spite of all the global threats to them, is phenomenal. But populations are increasing enormously. So there's definitely hope. And I think over the last 30 years, so much awareness has been raised within Oman and now within the entire region of the plight of this animal. And then within Oman, we've been collecting data and generating the political will to help. And three main ingredients when you start any conservation program is raising awareness, getting enough information to understand what to do, and then trying to somehow harness the political will to implement action to change things. So at least we've got those three basic ingredients to start with. Awareness, for example, we've had BBC come in and do a month of filming and produce a fantastic documentary on these humpback whales, and a lot of other awareness since then. And within Oman, we've now got 6 organizations particularly working together, mostly, not always, but mostly, trying to do research and trying to find ways to help conserve this really rare and unique population. So that's the organization that I work for, Five Oceans. Andy, I've mentioned once or twice in Future Seas. And then the Environment Society of Oman, which really began life because of these whales, still driving force behind their study and conservation. And then the Ministry of Fisheries, the Environment Authorities, it's now called, and the Natural History Museum of Oman, all getting behind the cause of this whale and other whales in a big way. And we also have tremendous global support because all of this work that's been done, I'm just the conduit for this information, but there's a huge team behind it all. I mean, we wouldn't fit all the individuals who've been out in boats in Oman in this room. It's been a massive team from all over the world. And big organizations are really getting behind us. So the IWC I've mentioned once or twice, now creating a conservation management plan for the Northwestern Indian Ocean for large whales in collaboration with various different countries. And Oman has just recently got on board with that and starting to support the idea of a regional conservation management plan. CMS, the Convention of Migratory Species, has already implemented a concerted action for these whales off Oman and in the Arabian Sea region generally. And the combined task force of IUCN and the World Commission on Protected Areas has developed what are called important marine mammal areas, which include large tracts of that ocean around Oman, which help protect or could help protect those humpback whales in that area. And then we have organizations like the International Maritime Organization that we're engaged with to see about moving shipping lanes and imposing speed reduction, speed limits on vessels through critical whale habitat. And that's beginning to take shape. We have the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission that we're working with to try and understand bycatch in fishing nets much more thoroughly. And a whole organization now, the Arabian Sea Whale Network, which one of those PhD students I mentioned earlier, Gianna Minton, really drives. And that is a consortium of researchers and conservationists from all around the region, from multiple countries in the Northwestern Indian Ocean, who are all working together and working with all these other organizations to try and look after and understand these unique whales much better. But here's a couple of key messages that I think are really important, because over 30 or 40 years of study of humpback whales in Oman, a lot of people feel that that's just all about the whales, but actually it's really not. And we've found information about oceanography, about ecosystem function, about water quality, about ecological health, all these indicators that the whales provide about the marine ecosystem as a whole, and also about the people who are benefiting from that marine ecosystem and the ecosystem services that it provides. So we're beginning to see that it's not just all about whales and people who are enthusiastic about whales. It's actually much bigger and broader than that. And that has a lot of implications, not only for industries like tourism, which might directly benefit commercially from whales, but also for industries like fisheries, the second largest industry in Oman, because of the understanding that which we're gaining. Whales are fish eaters, and we're beginning to understand a lot more about the systems that those whales live in, which can benefit fisheries. And ultimately, showing a link between people and whales. So this young Omani boy selling dates in Nizwa Souk seems like a very long way from tagging a humpback whale off Dhofar, but actually it's very much linked. And the whales are telling us about things which can directly relate to food and water security in Oman, for example. So creating those links is vital for Omanis particularly to understand, why we're doing it. We're not just doing it about the whales, we're doing it about the whole big picture as well. And ultimately it makes a difference to the country. Coming back to now though, after all that time, we're now at a critical time because we're not sure what that population is doing. It's tiny. We've got a very small whale population. We know that. It's unique. It's isolated. There's no chance of other whales coming in with the same genetic makeup of those whales. If they're gone, they're gone. They can't be replaced by whales from anywhere else in the world. So in the meantime, population growth is growing, more and more coastal development coming into their habitat. We've got the first offshore oil and gas operations have started up. We've got fisheries, shipping, and tourism all expanding. We've got this stress and this disease going on in this population. So we're really up against that, and all against the background of regional activities. Some of these whales are swimming to India, where they've got a whole other suite of threats to deal with, and a whole lot of other regional activities going on. But I'm really pleased to say that just recently, actually, after years and years of work, the Oman government has really decided to start to get behind this cause in a bigger way, and it's coming to the table to discuss how we might implement more specific mitigation measures to try and prevent those impacts in the longer term, and to try and ensure the survival of those unique whales, and maybe even the population growth that we're seeing elsewhere in the country, elsewhere in the world, sorry. Just to finish off, to say thank you very much to the Oman government, particularly those top three organizations who have always supported us in the sense that they provided permissions for us to do all this work over the years. The next three organizations, particularly Environment Society of Oman, Five Oceans and Future Seas, who've really driven a lot of the work in the field. But every program has a beginning, and it began with two key characters in Oman, Michael Gallagher and Rod Salm, who began this process of collecting information, which at the time seemed sparse and few and far between, but it all started adding up, and it was on that which the whole program was built. And many, many other colleagues besides myself and others that I've mentioned here this evening who have been involved in this work. Many sponsors, almost all of the work that we've done in Oman has come from sponsorship by businesses in Oman, particularly Renaissance Services, who really helped us ramp up the amount of work that we could do. All of those international organizations that I've mentioned. A big thank you to the British Omani Society for inviting me here. And perhaps most of all to the people of Oman, because we've been going out into remote parts of the country for decades and encountering people, of course, when we get there. And always they will invite you into their home. Always they will bring you food, and always they will show you kindness and assistance wherever we go. So I mean, that has been absolutely amazing wherever we've been. And here is to look at all of those international institutes that have been involved in the research over the years. In fact, this is not all of them. There's a lot more, but you can see they're from the USA, they're from Peru, from the UK, from Malaysia, from Cape Town, from South Africa, from Sweden, from all over the world that have been involved in the study of these unique whales for all this time. I've done 45 minutes, which I think was my maximum, so pretty good timing. So thank you all very much. And just before I sign off, if you want to know more, the Environment Society of Oman and some others of us have produced this Marine Mammal Atlas of Oman. It's an interactive atlas. It tells you all about the whales and dolphins of Oman. It's downloadable for free from here. And it's got an incredible amount of information on the humpback whale, the other large whales, and every other species that we've recorded so far in Oman. So please visit that site if you can, and have a look at some more information.